The day I needed to breathe the most was the very day my son took every single dollar without even leaving a note. Eleanor Price froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The old chair beneath her creaked as she sat motionless, staring at the screen of her phone. It wasn't a message from her son, Jackson. It wasn't a call from the bank. It was a simple notification that felt like a sledgehammer to her chest. Available balance, $0. She stared at it, willing the words to change, to somehow disappear, but they remained, mocking her. Over the years, Eleanor had built a life for herself, one small paycheck at a time. It had never been glamorous, but it had been hers. And now, with a single click, Jackson had erased it all. Every penny she had saved, every sacrifice she made, every long-hour work to ensure he had everything he needed gone. Her hands trembled as she dialed the bank. The voice on the other end was flat, businesslike. "Yes, ma'am, I'm seeing wire transfers totaling $80,000. The transactions were made to an account under the name of Jackson Arthur Price, her son Jackson, the boy she had raised with nothing but love and hard work, the boy she had poured everything into. And now he had stolen it all without a word of thanks, without a second glance. Eleanor hung up the phone. The silence that filled the house was deafening. The only sound was the tick of the clock in the kitchen, ticking away as if nothing had changed, as if her world hadn't just been ripped apart. And then, just as the weight of the moment began to settle in, the phone rang again. It was Doris, always full of chatter. "Ellie, have you seen Jackson's Instagram? He's in Rome, child, eating like a king. Oh, what a life they're living. You must be so proud." Doris's voice rang through the line, completely oblivious to the storm Eleanor was facing. Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she walked slowly to her bedroom, picked up her old phone, and opened Instagram. She wasn't big on social media, but she'd always kept an eye on Jackson from a distance, watching his life unfold like a movie she could never star in. There he was, Jackson, her son, smiling, dressed in a crisp white shirt, a glass raised in his hand. And beside him, Tonya, his wife, and Rhonda, her mother-in-law, both with wide smiles, basking in the luxury of their trip. The caption read, "Rome, my new beginning." "I deserve this." Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even feel the sting of betrayal she thought she would. She just stood there, staring at the photo. And then, without anyone noticing, she smiled. Not the kind of smile a mother gives her child. Not the kind of smile that speaks of pride. This was a different smile. A smile that said, "I've seen it all now." Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, holding the phone like a burning brick. The weight of what had just happened settled in her chest like a stone. She knew she had given her son everything. Her life, her love, her security, everything. And now, in a single moment, he had taken it all, gone. The money, the trust, the bond between mother and son, gone. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, just staring at the phone, at Jackson's smiling face, at the life he was living that was built on the foundation of her sacrifices. It wasn't just the money that hurt. It wasn't the betrayal that cut the deepest. It was the realization that her son, the boy she had raised with everything she had chosen to erase her, without a word. Without a second thought. Eleanor didn't break down. She didn't fall apart. She stood still, breathing slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of this new reality. She had always prided herself on being strong. But now, strength felt different. It wasn't about holding things together. It was about what you do when everything falls apart. And then, as if to drive the point home, the phone rang again. It was Doris. Eleanor felt a pang of irritation, but she answered anyway. Doris never seemed to know when to stop talking. But right now, her voice felt like the only thing that could break through the crushing silence. "Ellie, honey, you've got to see Jackson's Instagram. He's in Rome, can you believe it? What a life they're living, eating all that fancy food. Oh, I'm so jealous, I swear. Doris's voice was bubbling with excitement, completely unaware of the storm inside Eleanor's chest. Eleanor let her talk, but her mind wasn't on Doris. Her thoughts were elsewhere. They were on the life Jackson was living, the one that had cost her everything. And as Doris chatted away, Eleanor did something she never thought she would. She smiled, not out of happiness, not out of pride, but out of a deep, cutting realization. She had been a fool for believing she could give everything to him. Eleanor set the phone down, her fingers trembling. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was something else now, something she had never known before. She was done. The house felt older that night. It wasn't the age of the walls that made it feel different. It wasn't the worn carpets or the aging furniture. It was the fact that everything felt the same, but Eleanor had changed. Something inside her had shifted in the span of one phone call, one notification, and one Instagram post. She stood up from the chair and walked into the living room, looking around as if seeing her surroundings for the first time. The shelves held pictures of Jackson. Pictures of a little boy in a cap, of a teenager with a proud smile after his high school graduation, of a young man receiving his college diploma. The memories were there, but they no longer felt like hers. Eleanor sat down on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. She thought back to the years she had spent raising Jackson, long nights, early mornings, missed meals, and all the sacrifices she had made for him. The engagement ring she sold to put him through high school. The family land she gave up so he could go to college. The countless hours of overtime at the cleaning jobs, scrubbing floors and washing dishes, so he could have a better life. And what had it all amounted to? Nothing. She thought about the time she went to his apartment a week before the discovery. She had brought him his favorite meal, fried chicken and collard greens. She had waited for hours outside his door, but no one opened. When the doorman finally approached her, he told her, "I can't let you in if you didn't announce your visit." She had swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. He hadn't said it maliciously, but there was something in the way he said it, something that made her feel like an outsider in her own son's life. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, oppressive tension. Eleanor couldn't put her finger on exactly when the change happened. It wasn't like a storm that rolled in suddenly, but more like the slow gathering of dark clouds in the distance, unseen but felt. She spent her time doing what she had always done, cooking, cleaning, keeping to herself, but nothing felt the same. Not anymore. The phone calls were fewer now. Doris had stopped checking in. She didn't even need to look at the messages that came through. She knew exactly what they were about: more updates about Jackson's new life. The money was gone, and so was the son who had once needed her. He had slipped away like sand through her fingers, and now all she was left with was an empty house and a broken heart. But Eleanor wasn't heartbroken. Not anymore. What she felt now was something colder, something sharper. It was the realization that she had been invisible to him for years. She had given him everything, and all she had gotten in return was distance, dismissiveness, and now this outright betrayal. The old pain had transformed into something more dangerous, something far less easy to ignore. The phone rang again. It was Jackson. His voice on the other end sounded strained, desperate. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch. She felt no rush to respond. Jackson had always been in a hurry to get what he wanted, but now he was the one who needed something. Needed her, maybe. Or at least that's what he thought. "Mom." His voice was smaller now, like he was trying to figure out the right words. "I know what you did, Jackson," she said, her voice steady, calm. "I know about the money." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you do, Mom?" he asked, the desperation rising in his voice. "Everything's falling apart. I don't know who to turn to." Eleanor's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. It wasn't her son on the other end anymore. It was just a boy who had learned nothing from the love she had given him. "I didn't do anything, Jackson. You did this." All of it. She felt a strange calm wash over her. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into a world Eleanor had never imagined she would enter. Each morning she awoke, the weight of betrayal no longer stunned her. Instead, it simmered beneath the surface, an ever-present reminder that something crucial had been lost but also something vital had been gained. The stillness of the house seemed to grow louder. The silence between her and the world was no longer a void of grief. It had become a quiet resolve. She didn't need to scream or rage. She didn't even need to cry. No, Eleanor had learned long ago that the most powerful weapon a mother can possess isn't anger, it's silence, and right now, her silence was speaking louder than anything she could say. Each day was filled with small, seemingly insignificant routines, filling her cup with chamomile tea. Staring out the window at the same cracked pavement, the same lazy dogs that wandered the street. But underneath it all, something was stirring. It wasn't pain. It wasn't regret. It was the kind of calm that settles over you when you know, deep down, that you've finally taken control of your life. Eleanor wasn't going to let Jackson steal her peace. He had taken her money. He had taken her trust. He had taken her sense of security. But he could not take her ability to stand tall, to walk forward with strength that could not be shaken. The phone rang again, cutting through the stillness of her afternoon. This time, it wasn't Doris chattering about trivial things. It was the bank calling to confirm more details about the stolen funds. She had expected this, but what she didn't expect was the sharp twist in her gut when they mentioned Jackson by name, confirming that every penny had gone directly into his hands. There it was. The truth, plain and simple. Jackson hadn't just stolen her savings. He had chosen to take everything she had worked for, everything she had built. He had made that decision, and now he had to face the consequences. Eleanor hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the revelation sank in. She hadn't been surprised when she found out Jackson had drained her account. She had known, deep down, that this day would come. The signs had been there. The dismissive comments, the lack of gratitude, the subtle distancing that had started years ago. Jackson had always been a little too wrapped up in his own world. Tanya had only made it worse. But what struck Eleanor now wasn't just the loss of money, it was the realization that she had allowed him to slip away. She closed her eyes, allowing the silence to envelop her. There was no shouting, no pleading. She didn't need to beg him to come back. She didn't need him to apologize. What she needed was something more. The days stretched into a week before Jackson called again. This time, his voice was smaller, tinged with something unfamiliar fear. Eleanor couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't triumph. It was something else entirely. It was justice, Mom. Jackson's voice cracked on the other end of the line. "I need to talk to you." Eleanor didn't rush to respond. She had already heard everything she needed to hear. She didn't need to answer his desperate call right away. There was nothing left to say. Instead, she allowed him to sit with his guilt for just a moment longer. "What happened, Jackson?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made him falter. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" There was a long pause, and Eleanor could practically hear the wheels turning in Jackson's head. "He had no answers, Mom." "Please," he finally said, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought it would be different. I thought you would understand. Eleanor clenched her jaw, feeling the sting of his words. Did he think she didn't understand? Did he think that she hadn't given everything to him? "I don't need you to understand, Jackson," Eleanor replied, her voice low but steady. "I need you to face the reality of what you've done." A heavy silence followed, thick with tension. Jackson didn't know what to say. The apology he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head felt weak now. It wasn't enough. The money was gone, but something even more precious had been stolen. His mother's trust. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Eleanor didn't answer him right away. She didn't rush to offer forgiveness. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that forgiveness was not something to be given lightly, it was something that had to be earned. And Jackson had yet to earn it. "I know you are," she said simply, before adding, "but I can't help you, Jackson." Not anymore. There was a finality in her voice that made the blood drain from Jackson's face. The room felt smaller, colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had lost her. For good. The following days were filled with the cold silence that followed Jackson's departure from the house. He didn't come back. He didn't try to fix things. He had no idea how. Eleanor didn't care. She had already moved on. She turned her attention to the next phase of her plan. It wasn't about getting revenge on Jackson. No, it was about taking back what was hers and ensuring that this kind of betrayal never happened again. The money could be replaced. But her dignity? That was priceless. And it was something Jackson would never be able to steal again. She contacted her lawyer, started the paperwork to freeze Jackson's accounts, and began filing complaints for fraud and identity theft. She wasn't doing this for the money. She was doing this so that Jackson would understand that actions have consequences, and that, for the first time in his life, someone had said no to him. The last phone call came from the authorities. They had gathered enough evidence. They had secured the necessary documents. Jackson's theft was no longer just a betrayal. It was a crime. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace. She had been right all along. Jackson had thought he could take everything from her and walk away scot-free. But now Eleanor knew he was the one who would have to face the consequences of his actions. As the call ended, Eleanor sat quietly, allowing the weight of it all to settle around her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She was just done. Jackson didn't know it yet, but the trap was already closing around him. The phone calls, the legal documents, the investigations, they were all happening behind the scenes, invisible to him, but slowly and surely pulling him deeper into a web he couldn't escape. He thought he could outrun the consequences, but he was wrong. The more he tried to ignore the problem, the tighter the grip on him became. Back in Los Angeles, Eleanor moved with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from years of enduring hardship. She wasn't going to beg for justice. She wasn't going to ask for mercy. She was going to make sure Jackson learned the hard way that you can't just take from people and expect them to let it go. She'd heard from Walter, her old friend, that Jackson's accounts had been frozen, that the evidence was now irrefutable. Her son had crossed a line. There was no going back from this, not for him, not for her. The first shock came when Jackson's bank card was declined. He had spent the past few days trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was all some mistake. The money hadn't disappeared. It was just temporarily blocked, right, wrong. As he walked out of a trendy cafe in Rome, the card that had once been his golden ticket to the life he wanted, the life he had stolen from his mother, was suddenly worthless. He tried again and again. Each time the machine spit the card back out with a cold, indifferent rejection. The knot in his stomach tightened. Tonya was beside him, her face tight with frustration. "What the hell is going on? We need that money." "What did you do, Jackson?" Jackson's face paled as he stared at the machine, his mind racing. How had this happened? He pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. What he saw left him stunned. Account frozen. Fraud investigation in progress. He read it again and again. This couldn't be happening. Eleanor must have done something. He rushed to a nearby cafe to make a phone call to his mother, his heart pounding in his chest. She was the only one who could fix this. She had to. "Mom," Jackson said, his voice shaky as he dialed her number. "What's going on with my accounts? Why is everything frozen? What did you do?" The words spilled out in a panicked rush, and for the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable. He had always assumed his mother would just forgive him, that she would bail him out when things went wrong. But this was different. This time, she wasn't responding as the mother who protected him. She wasn't the one willing to overlook his mistakes. The phone rang. And then, finally, Eleanor's voice on the other end of the line. Steady and calm, "I didn't do anything." "Jackson," she replied, her voice colder than he remembered. "You did this. You stole from me. And now you have to face the consequences." For a moment, Jackson couldn't speak. The weight of her words hit him like a slap. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was just matter of fact. And that was worse than any shouting, any blaming. "I never wanted this for you," Eleanor continued, her tone unchanged. "I wanted you to be better than this. But you've shown me who you really are. And now you'll have to deal with it." Jackson felt his world slip further out of control. What had started as a small mistake, a moment of weakness, he had convinced himself had spiraled into something far bigger. Now his mother wasn't just letting it slide. She wasn't going to be the victim he could brush off with a quick apology. Eleanor had made her move, and he couldn't stop it. "I'm sorry, Mom," Jackson whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were empty. He had taken everything from her, and no amount of sorry was going to fix that. "You took everything from me," Eleanor replied, her voice low but strong. "You can't just take what's mine and expect me to forget. You've taken my security, my peace of mind, and you thought I wouldn't notice. You were wrong." Jackson wanted to argue. He wanted to fight, to beg for forgiveness, but something in her voice told him that this time was different. She wasn't the woman he could manipulate with promises of change. "I didn't mean for this to happen." He tried again, his voice barely above a whisper, but Eleanor was done with the excuses. She had heard them all before. "You've made your choices, Jackson. Now you need to live with them." Jackson sat there, phone still pressed to his ear, feeling the reality of his situation close in on him. He was on the verge of losing everything. The money, the life he had built, the freedom he had so arrogantly taken for granted. He hadn't realized it before, but now the full weight of his actions crushed him. Eleanor, the woman who had given him everything, had finally reached her breaking point. And there was no turning back. Back in Los Angeles, Eleanor was moving with quiet determination. The investigations were progressing. Jackson's stolen funds were being traced, his accounts frozen, and a fraud report had been filed. The authorities were involved now, and Jackson was starting to feel the full weight of his actions. He hadn't just stolen from his mother. He had crossed the line into something much bigger. Eleanor didn't need to see Jackson suffer. She didn't need to watch him pay for what he'd done. She had already won. The last of her savings, everything she had worked for, was slowly being restored. The fraud investigation was moving quickly now, and Eleanor could rest easy knowing that Jackson wouldn't be able to run from this. The walls were closing in on him. She had done this not out of anger, but out of necessity. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Days passed, and Jackson continued to spiral. The money was gone. The charges were mounting. He had no one left to turn to. Tonya had vanished. Rhonda wasn't picking up his calls. He was alone in a foreign city, with nowhere to go. And then, the final blow came. It came when Jackson opened his email one final time. His heart sank as he saw the subject line, "Notice of investigation." The email from the U.S. Embassy confirmed it. Jackson was being investigated for financial fraud related to his theft of his mother's savings. His accounts were officially frozen. Any assets he had overseas were now being seized. He had been living in a bubble, thinking he could get away with it all, but now the reality hit him. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Eleanor had taken back her power. He dialed his mother's number one last time, but this time there was no sense of urgency, no pleading in his voice. It was too late for that. The phone rang, and when Eleanor answered, her voice was calm. "I told you, Jackson," she said. "You have to live with what you've done. I won't be there to save you. You never understood that before." Jackson's mind raced as the days bled into one another. The investigation wasn't just about the stolen money anymore. It was about the web of lies he had built around himself and the people he had hurt along the way. Tonya was gone. Rhonda had cut him off. He was alone, completely alone. He thought of his mother, sitting quietly in that small house in Los Angeles, untouched by the chaos that had now engulfed him. And for the first time, he felt the full weight of his betrayal. He had always known deep down that Eleanor was strong, that she was more than capable of standing on her own. But he had never really understood what strength truly meant. It wasn't until now, with his life crumbling and nothing left to hold onto, that he realized how deeply he had underestimated her. She wasn't the desperate, weak woman he had tried to paint her as. She was his reckoning. He thought back to the conversations they had shared, the casual dismissals of her concerns. He had thought she would always be there, always be the one who would forgive. But now, with everything slipping through his fingers, he realized how wrong he had been. Eleanor wasn't going to save him. She was never going to save him. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to move with the calm precision that had defined her in the past weeks. Her days were filled with small, routine tasks, but each action, no matter how simple, felt more important now than ever before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving in the silence of her own victory, even though the world around her was still in turmoil. The authorities had gathered enough evidence. And Jackson's situation was worsening by the day. The charges were piling up: fraud, identity theft, financial abuse. The authorities were closing in on him faster than he realized. Eleanor knew that her son was probably sitting somewhere, trying to find a way out. She knew he was scared, maybe even ashamed. But none of that mattered anymore. The truth had already caught up with him. She didn't need to see Jackson suffer. She didn't need to hear his apologies. She didn't even need him to face her. She had already made her peace. Days turned into weeks, and Jackson's panic only grew. Every time he thought about calling his mother, his heart twisted in guilt. He had always thought she would be there to pick up the pieces, to forgive him when things went wrong. But now he realized that there was nothing left to fix. The money was gone. The trust was gone. And his relationship with Eleanor was gone. For the first time, he understood what it meant to lose something that truly mattered. He spent sleepless nights wondering where everything went wrong. He had taken from her for so long, convinced that she would never stop giving. But now he was the one with nothing. Jackson sat in the same dingy hotel room he had checked into weeks ago, staring at the walls, unable to escape the growing sense of dread in his chest. He was trapped. The authorities had issued a final demand. He had to come forward. He had to answer for what he had done. But even as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions, part of him held out hope. Maybe, just maybe, his mother would take pity on him. Maybe she would bail him out, the way she always had in the past. But Eleanor had already made her decision. She wasn't going to save him. Not this time. Not anymore. The phone rang late one evening, the sound echoing through the empty house. Eleanor was sitting at her kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her. The phone sat in front of her like an omen. She had been expecting this call for days. When she picked up the receiver, her voice was calm, as always. "Hello, Mom." Jackson's voice broke through the silence, filled with desperation. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't fix this. I've lost everything. Eleanor listened, but she didn't interrupt. She knew what he was feeling. She had felt that way too, but not anymore. I never thought it would come to this, Jackson continued, his voice shaky. I never thought you would really stop caring. I thought you'd always forgive me. I thought I could fix it all. I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the receiver. She had already forgiven him. But forgiveness didn't mean she had to save him, Jackson, she said softly, but with an unyielding strength behind her words. It's too late for apologies. You had your chance, and you chose to take everything from me. There was silence on the other end of the line. Jackson didn't know what to say. He had already lost. Eleanor continued, her voice steady, but with a finality that made Jackson's heart drop. I loved you, Jackson. I gave you everything. But I can't continue to let you take from me. You've taken too much already. And now you have to face the consequences of your actions. Asterisk. The finality of Eleanor's words echoed through Jackson's mind long after the call ended. He had lost her. He had lost everything. And now there was no turning back. He had been foolish. He had taken her love, her generosity, her trust for granted, never thinking that it could one day run out. But now he understood. Now he realized that the woman who had given him everything had finally reached the point where there was nothing left to give. Jackson sank down into the chair, feeling the weight of his decisions crush him. The money was gone. The relationships were gone. And so was his chance at redemption. The truth had finally hit him like a brick wall. He had lost his mother, and the worst part was, he didn't know if he could ever earn her back. Eleanor sat back in her chair, a quiet sense of peace washing over her as the final pieces of her plan fell into place. She didn't need Jackson's forgiveness. She didn't need his apologies. What mattered was that she had finally taken control. The legal process was now underway. Jackson's stolen funds were being recovered, and the fraud charges against him would ensure that he would pay for what he had done. Eleanor wasn't seeking revenge. She had already gotten what she needed: her dignity, her peace of mind, her ability to stand on her own, unbroken, no matter what her son had taken from her. As the final documents were signed, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had done what was right, what needed to be done. And now she could let go. The chapter was over. The sun set softly over the city, casting long shadows through the small windows of Eleanor's home. It had been months since the phone call with Jackson. The investigation had continued, and the case against him had escalated. His life had crumbled in ways he never thought possible, but Eleanor had found peace. She sat in her rocking chair, the one that had seen years of her struggle and triumph. It creaked gently as she rocked back and forth, her mind wandering over the many years she had spent raising Jackson. The memories flooded her, those moments of joy, the quiet nights when she cooked his favorite meal, the day she had sacrificed everything to give him a future. But now, those days felt like they belonged to someone else. The phone had stopped ringing. The visits had become less frequent. Doris, the neighbor who had once called her every week, had stopped checking in. Even Jackson's face had faded from her mind over time. But as Eleanor sat there, alone in her quiet home, she realized something. She had given Jackson everything she could. And now it was his turn to live with the consequences. There was nothing more she could do. Jackson sat on the worn couch in his new, empty apartment, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He hadn't been in touch with his mother for months. He couldn't bear to pick up the phone, couldn't find the right words to say. Every time he thought about calling her, the weight of what he had done crushed him. How could he apologize for something so unforgivable? The money, the betrayal, the lies, they had all come crashing down on him. He was living with the aftermath now, the consequences of his own making. He thought about the last time he saw his mother. Her voice on the phone had been steady, calm, and that was what had made it so much worse. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting or crying. She was done. It wasn't the forgiveness he had hoped for. It was the silence. Eleanor picked up the red notebook that had been her constant companion throughout this ordeal. She opened it to the last page, the one where she had written her final thoughts, her last words to Jackson. As she read it again, she felt no bitterness, no anger. The words had already been spoken, and she had made peace with the past. "My dearest Jackson," she had written, "you were my reason for getting up every morning. You were my fight, my strength, my pride. I gave you everything I had, and I don't regret a single moment of it. But you forgot. You forgot who you were and what I had given you. You surrounded yourself with people who only knew how to take, and in the end, you took everything from me. I don't hate you. I could never hate you. But I can't carry you anymore. The world you've built for yourself isn't one that I recognize. But maybe, in time, you'll understand. Maybe, in time, you'll realize what you lost." She closed the notebook, her heart still heavy but lighter than it had been months ago. Jackson would have to find his way. But she had already let him go. It was late at night when Jackson found himself walking down the streets of the neighborhood where he grew up. The faded walls, the familiar street lights, the small vendors selling food, it all looked the same. But it wasn't the same. Not for him. He paused in front of the old house he had once shared with his mother. The windows were dark, the front door closed, but he could still see her in his mind. He could see her sitting on the porch, her eyes gentle but tired, watching the world go by as she always had. She had always been there, quietly waiting for him to realize what he had lost. He had finally understood, but it was too late. The next morning, Eleanor received a letter. It was from Jackson. She had stopped expecting anything from him long ago, but there it was, his handwriting on the envelope. She opened it carefully, her heart beating slightly faster. Inside, there was a single page of paper with a short message. "I've been thinking about everything. I can't change what I did, and I can't take back what I've stolen from you. I'm sorry, Mom, I wish I had been different. But I can't undo the past. I know you probably won't ever forgive me, but I hope one day you'll see I wasn't always this person. I still love you, Jackson." Eleanor folded the letter, her hand steady. She didn't need to forgive him. She had already forgiven herself. Days passed, and Jackson continued to walk the streets of his past, unsure of where his life would go from here. But Eleanor had already moved on. She had made peace with the fact that she couldn't fix him. She had given him everything, and now she was free to live the rest of her life on her own terms. She wasn't angry. She wasn't heartbroken. She was done. In her final moments, Eleanor didn't cry. She sat in her rocking chair, the world outside still bustling, but inside there was only a quiet, serene peace. The cancer had taken its toll on her body, but her spirit had never been stronger. The end came quietly, as if she had known it all along. She went peacefully, with a smile on her lips, knowing she had done everything she could for Jackson. He was no longer her responsibility. He had to find his own way, just as she had found hers. Jackson arrived at the hospital later that day. It wasn't a surprise. He had known this was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. When he saw her, so still and peaceful, he realized just how much he had lost. There were no more words left between them, no more chances to make things right. The mother who had loved him unconditionally was gone. Jackson knelt beside her bed, the weight of regret crushing him. He placed a hand on her cold, lifeless one, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry." But Eleanor was gone. And so, with her passing, the final chapter closed. Eleanor's funeral was simple, just as she had wanted it. There were no elaborate wreaths, no fancy flowers, just a small group of neighbors who had loved her in silence. Jackson wasn't there. He had no right to be. But as the day ended, as the sun sank low over the horizon, Eleanor's legacy lived on. Not in the money she had given or the love she had sacrificed, but in the strength she had shown, strength that had guided her through life's hardest moments and ultimately led her to find peace. Jackson returned to the same streets, the same life he had once left behind, but this time it was different. The weight of his mother's absence hung over him like a shadow, and he carried it with him wherever he went. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he knew one thing now. Eleanor had given him everything she had, and it had been enough. It was up to him to find his way back, not for her, but for himself. As he stood in front of the old house one last time, he whispered into the wind, "I'll make it right, somehow, for you, Mom." And for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt the faintest flicker of hope.